Courtney Briggs did not hesitate. She plucked the insulin pen and the small orange prescription bottle straight out of Walter Graves's hands, didn't ask, didn't warn, and held them up between two fingers like she was handling something pulled from a gutter. "Sir?" Her voice was bright, almost cheerful, the way people sound when they've already decided the answer. "I don't know what kind of operation you think you're running, but I've been doing this job for 11 years. And in 11 years, I have never once seen an elderly black man board my plane alone in a wrinkled shirt, carrying unlabeled drugs in his breast pocket, and had it turn out to be nothing." Dropped the insulin pen into the galley trash. Then she held up the nitroglycerin bottle, turned it slowly, read the label out loud, not to verify it, but to perform skepticism for anyone watching. "Walter Graves. Sure it is, honey." The bottle followed the pen. That same hollow plastic clatter. Walter opened his mouth. She cut him off before a single word came out. "Don't. I've heard every story. It's prescribed. My doctor knows. I need it to survive. You people always have a story." She said "you people" the way some say it, not by accident. Deliberately. Casually. Like it cost her nothing. "Now sit down or get off my plane." Walter didn't move. Didn't raise his voice. Just watched his medications disappear behind a swinging trash lid and pressed one hand quietly against his chest, where his heart had been quietly misbehaving for 2 years. What Courtney didn't know, what no one on Flight 2291 knew yet, was that the man she had just humiliated had a son. And that son was standing at Gate C9 4 minutes away, with the kind of authority that could shut this entire operation down before the wheels ever left the ground. This story is going to make your blood boil, and then it's going to make you stand up and cheer. Don't scroll away. Drop your city and your local time in the comments right now. I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. And if you believe every human being deserves to be treated with dignity, you already know what to do with that subscribe button. Walter Graves had never been a loud man. In 38 years as a principal at Roosevelt High School in the South Bronx, he had broken up fights, buried students, called parents at midnight with news no parent should ever receive. And he had done all of it without once raising his voice above the level of a firm, unhurried conversation. His staff used to say that when Mr. Graves went quiet, that was when you needed to pay the most attention. Silence in Walter's world was not absence. It was weight. He retired in 2019 with a gymnasium full of people who loved him. Teachers he had hired 20 years ago. Students who were now doctors, engineers, social workers, people who credited one man's patience for the entire trajectory of their lives. The city councilwoman gave a speech. The superintendent cried. Walter stood at the podium in his best suit and said simply, "I just tried to see people clearly. That's all any of us can do." He meant it. He had always meant it. Now he was 72 years old, traveling alone from LaGuardia to Atlanta on a Tuesday morning in May, and he had dressed carefully for the occasion. Navy blue button-down shirt pressed the night before. Gray slacks with a sharp crease. His good shoes, the ones his late wife Dorothy had picked out for him at a department store in 2014, the last Christmas before her diagnosis. He wore them only for important things. Imani's graduation qualified. Imani, his granddaughter. 18 years old, first in her class at Westlake Academy in Atlanta, full scholarship to Spelman College, beginning in the fall. Walter had a photograph of her in his breast pocket, small, slightly worn at the edges, the same photo he had carried since she was accepted. In it, she was holding her acceptance letter with both hands, and grinning so wide her eyes had nearly disappeared. He had looked at that photo approximately 400 times in the past 3 months. He had booked this trip 6 weeks in advance. His son Marcus had insisted on upgrading the ticket first-class seat. Because Marcus knew about Walter's heart, about the 2 years of cardiology appointments and medication adjustments and careful living that had followed a minor cardiac event in the winter of 2022. "You're not sitting in a middle seat for 2.5 hours with your condition, Dad," Marcus had said, and Walter had protested exactly once before accepting, because at 72 you learned which arguments were worth having. His carry-on bag contained 3 things of real importance. The first was a change of clothes for the graduation ceremony, a charcoal suit folded with the precision of a man who had learned to be careful with nice things. The second was a card for Imani, handwritten across 3 pages in Walter's small, steady handwriting, telling her everything he had never quite found the right moment to say out loud. The third was a framed photograph of Dorothy taken at Imani's 8th birthday party, laughing at something someone had said just off camera. Dorothy had died 14 months after that photo was taken. Walter never traveled without her. His medications lived in his breast pocket, as they always had. The insulin pen, thin, pale blue, pre-filled, prescribed by Dr. Elaine Foster at Montefiore Medical Center, refilled 10 days ago. The nitroglycerin tablets, small orange bottle, his name on the label. In clean black type, the pharmacy's sticker with Dr. Foster's contact information on the back. He had carried both for years. They were as automatic as his wallet, as his keys, as the reading glasses he kept folded in his shirt collar. He arrived at gate C11 40 minutes before boarding. He found a seat near the window, watched the ground crew move around the aircraft with the particular purposeful efficiency he had always admired in people who knew their work, and he called Marcus to confirm his arrival. "You good, Dad?" "I'm good, son. Plane's right there. Call me when you land, and eat something before you board. You know what Dr. Foster said about your levels in the morning?" "I know what Dr. Foster said, Dad." "I'll eat something, Marcus." He bought a blueberry muffin from the terminal cafe and ate half of it because 72 years of independence dies hard. Then boarding was called, and he gathered his things, and he walked to the gate with his ticket in hand. First-class seat 2B, and he felt in the particular way that older men sometimes feel before important journeys, that this trip mattered, that being there for Imani mattered, that Dorothy would have wanted him on that plane. The gate agent scanned his ticket without looking at him. He stepped onto the jet bridge. He walked down the narrow corridor toward the aircraft door, and he could already hear the soft, ambient sounds of the cabin. The overhead bins clicking open and shut, the low murmur of passengers settling in the recycled hum of pressurized air. He stepped through the aircraft door. A flight attendant looked up from the galley. Courtney Briggs. 11 years with American Airlines performance reviews that described her as professional, composed, detail-oriented. She looked at Walter, at his pressed slacks, his good shoes, his boarding pass held politely in one hand, and something moved behind her eyes. A calculation, quick and quiet, and invisible to anyone who hadn't spent 38 years learning to read the rooms that people built around themselves. "Economy is that way, sir," she said, gesturing toward the back of the aircraft, before he had spoken a single word. Walter looked at his boarding pass, then at her. Then, because he had not survived 38 years of other people's assumptions by making scenes in public, he said simply, "I'm in 2B." Courtney's expression didn't change, but she didn't move aside either. "Let me see that." He handed her the ticket. She studied it for a moment longer than necessary, then handed it back without comment, and stepped aside with the particular body language of someone who has decided to let a thing go for now, but has not finished with it. Walter found his seat, stowed his carry-on, settled in by the window. He reached into his breast pocket to check his medications, a habit as automatic as breathing. That was when Courtney appeared beside him, and that was when everything changed. She didn't ask. That was the part Deshaun Porter would describe later in the video that would eventually be watched by 70 million people. Not what she said, not even what she did, but the fact that she didn't ask. That she looked at a 72-year-old man reaching into his own breast pocket and made a decision, instantaneous, automatic, certain about what he must be doing and why. Courtney Briggs reached across Walter Graves and took the insulin pen from his hand before it had fully cleared his pocket. Then she reached back and took the nitroglycerin bottle from the seat pocket where he had just set it down. She held both items at arm's length, the way you hold something you're not sure is safe to touch, and she turned them over with the exaggerated carefulness of a performance. Walter was very still. "Ma'am," he said, "those are my medications. My name is on both labels." Courtney tilted the insulin pen toward the overhead light and read the label with theatrical slowness. Dr. Elaine Foster, Montefiore Medical Center, 917-555. She said the phone number out loud like it was a punchline. "You want me to call this number right now at 6:45 in the morning?" "Awesome. If you need to verify it, yes, call her." Courtney set the insulin pen on the galley counter behind her, out of Walter's reach, and picked up the nitroglycerin bottle. She read that label too. Then she looked at Walter with an expression that managed to be simultaneously polite and completely contemptuous. "Walter Graves," a small pause. "Sure it is, honey." She said it the way people say things they know they can get away with. Light, casual, untouchable. She dropped the nitroglycerin bottle into the galley trash. Then she dropped the insulin pen in after it. The sound was small, hollow, plastic against plastic. But in the sudden silence of the first-class cabin, it landed like something much larger. Walter said quietly, "Ma'am, those medications keep me alive." "Then you should have packed them properly," Courtney said. "In a clearly labeled Ziploc bag with a printed prescription, like the TSA website instructs." "The TSA website does not require, sir." Her voice sharpened by exactly 1 degree. "I have been doing this job for 11 years. I know what the TSA website says." In row 14, Deshaun Porter had already opened his camera. He was 28 years old, a graphic designer from Queens, traveling to Atlanta for a client meeting, and he had watched the entire exchange from the moment Courtney reached across Walter's seat. His hands were steady. His expression was not. He pressed record. "American Airlines throwing away an old black man's medicine," he said quietly into the camera, barely moving his lips. "Watch this." Walter pointed to his medical ID bracelet, silver, engraved, worn on his left wrist for 2 years. "I have a heart condition and type 2 diabetes. Both are documented. My doctor's number is on both labels. I am asking you to return my medications." Courtney glanced at the bracelet, the way you glance at something you've already decided is irrelevant. "Medical ID bracelets cost $12 on Amazon, sir." From row 11, Dr. Amara Obi had half risen from her seat. She was 34 years old, an ER physician at Bellevue Hospital, traveling to Atlanta for a cardiology conference, which was, she would reflect later, a detail almost too pointed to be believed. She had watched Courtney drop the medications and felt the particular cold clarity that comes to emergency physicians when they identify a situation that is about to become dangerous. She stood fully. "Excuse me," she said. "I'm a physician. I can verify that both of those items are standard prescribed medical devices. The insulin pen is, ma'am." Courtney turned to her with the same bright, immovable expression. "You are not authorized to make medical determinations aboard this aircraft. Please return to your seat. He's a diabetic with a cardiac condition, and you just threw away his nitroglycerin. Return to your seat, please. Dr. Obi did not return to her seat. She stood in the aisle and she looked at Courtney Briggs with the flat, assessing eyes of someone who had spent a decade in emergency rooms watching people make catastrophically wrong calls, and she said very clearly, "If that man goes into hypoglycemia or cardiac distress on this flight, and the record shows you were warned, you will be personally liable. I want you to understand that before you ask me to sit down again." A beat of silence. Courtney smiled, small, controlled, certain. "I'll take that under advisement," she said. Then she took out her personal phone. She held it up toward Walter and photographed the prescription label on the nitroglycerin bottle still visible through the translucent side of the trash bag, with the deliberate movements of someone establishing a record. "I'm sending this to TSA," she said, not looking at Walter, her thumbs moving across the screen. "Let them figure out if Walter Graves is even a real person." The cabin went very quiet. Walter looked at Courtney for a long moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not move. He simply looked at her with the steady, patient eyes of a man who had spent 38 years seeing people clearly, including the ones who didn't want to be seen, and he said nothing at all, because some things don't need a response. Some things only need a witness. Deshawn's camera didn't waver. 12 seconds later, Supervisor Glenn Tate stepped through the aircraft door, and Courtney turned to meet him with the smooth efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. Whatever she told him first. And in the architecture of institutional power, first always mattered. Glenn Tate had worked gate supervision at LaGuardia for 9 years. I was 51 years old, methodical, conflict-averse, in the particular way of people who have confused avoiding confrontation with maintaining order. He had a good record and a moderate temperament and a deeply ingrained tendency to defer to whoever spoke to him first with the most confidence in the most official-sounding language. Courtney Briggs had been speaking to him in exactly that register for the 40 seconds before he reached Walter's row. By the time Glenn looked at Walter Graves, sitting quietly in seat 2B, hands folded in his lap, press still crisp, despite everything he had already received his briefing. Passenger non-compliant. Suspicious medication. Possible security concern. Crew safety protocol invoked. He stood in the aisle and he looked at Walter with the careful blankness of a man executing a procedure. "Sir, I need you to produce verifiable documentation for any medications you're carrying. Printed prescription pharmacy receipt, or a letter from a licensed physician on official letterhead." Walter held his gaze. "My documentation is on the labels of both items, which your colleague has disposed of." "Sir, both labels carry my full name, the prescribing physician's name, her direct phone number, and the pharmacy's verification code. I am asking that those items be retrieved from the trash and those numbers be called." Glenn looked at Courtney. Courtney gave him the small, certain nod of someone who has already resolved the situation in their own mind and is simply waiting for the institution to catch up. "Without verifiable printed documentation," Glenn said, turning back to Walter, "we are unable to permit non-standard items aboard the aircraft. That is American Airlines policy section." "I have the prescription printout," Walter said. "In my carry-on. Give me 30 seconds. He stood carefully, the way men with heart conditions learn to stand without rushing, and reached up to open the overhead bin. He unzipped the front pocket of his carry-on and produced a folded sheet of paper. A pharmacy printout from Walgreens on Jerome Avenue in the Bronx, dated 11 days ago, with his name, both medications, Dr. Foster's information, and the prescription numbers printed in clean black type. He handed it to Glenn. Glenn looked at it. Then he handed it to Courtney. Courtney held it at the same arm's length she had held the medications. She read it with the same theatrical slowness. Then she folded it once and handed it back to Walter. "Anyone can print something," she said. The 4 words landed in the cabin like a door slamming. Deshawn in row 14 exhaled through his nose. His stream had been live for 6 minutes. The viewer count had crossed 12,000. Comments were moving faster than he could read them. A wall of capital letters and exclamation points and people tagging news accounts and airline complaint handles with the urgent energy of a crowd that recognizes injustice in real time. Dr. Obi was still standing in the aisle. She had not sat down despite Courtney's instruction, and no one had physically compelled her to, because even Courtney understood that removing a physician from her feet during a medical dispute carried its own category of risk. "That printout," Dr. Obi said, her voice precise and controlled, "is exactly the documentation your policy requires. You just told him his documentation is insufficient because you've decided in advance that it's insufficient. That is not protocol. That is bias dressed up as protocol. Ma'am, I want Glenn Tate's employee ID number, and I want it on record that I am a licensed emergency physician and I am formally advising you that this passenger's medical needs are being deliberately obstructed." Glenn shifted his weight. Something moved behind his eyes, not quite doubt, but the early ancestor of it. Courtney moved first, before the doubt could develop into anything actionable. She turned to face the cabin, not Glenn, not Walter, not Dr. Obi, the whole cabin, and she reached up and pressed the button for the aircraft's internal PA system. Her voice came out of every speaker simultaneously smooth and professional, and carrying the particular authority of institutional amplification. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the slight delay to our departure. We are currently addressing a passenger compliance issue and expect to resolve it shortly. We appreciate your patience." 160 people heard those words. 160 people looked toward the front of the cabin. 160 people saw a 72-year-old black man sitting quietly in seat 2B with a folded prescription printout in his hands. A woman in row 7 pulled her handbag closer to her body. A man in row 3 looked up from his laptop with the mildly irritated expression of someone whose morning has been complicated by a stranger's problem. A child in row 9 asked her mother what was happening, and her mother said quietly, "Nothing, baby, just sit still." Walter felt it. He had spent 38 years in institutions. He knew exactly what a public announcement like that cost a person, not in money, not in policy, but in the invisible currency of other people's assumptions. In 30 seconds, Courtney had taken a private confrontation and turned it into a public verdict. 160 strangers had just been told, without being told, that Walter Graves was a problem. He looked out the window. The tarmac. The ground crew moving with their quiet, purposeful efficiency. The early morning sky over LaGuardia pale and flat and indifferent. He pressed one hand against his chest. His heart was doing the thing it sometimes did, not painful, not yet, but present, noticeable, a reminder. He needed his medications. He turned to Glenn Tate and said, with the steady voice of a man who has survived worse than this, "Sir, I am a 72-year-old diabetic with a documented heart condition. I am asking you, not demanding, asking to retrieve my medications from that trash can. Not for my comfort, for my safety." Glenn opened his mouth. His radio crackled before he could speak. The gate agent outside, "Supervisor, we're 6 minutes to pushback." Glenn looked at his watch, then at Courtney, then at Walter. And he made the choice that people make when they confuse urgency with rightness. "Sir, if you cannot produce documentation that satisfies our crew's safety assessment, I'm going to have to ask you to deplane." Walter's phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't reach for it. It buzzed again. He looked down. The screen was lit with an incoming call from a number he didn't immediately recognize, 202 area code. Washington. He let it go to voicemail. Walter folded his prescription printout carefully, placed it in his shirt pocket next to the photograph of Imani, next to the space where his medications should have been. And he sat very, very still while somewhere in his chest, his body began the quiet, patient work of compensating for what it was being denied. The human body does not negotiate. It does not respond to institutional authority or crew safety protocol or the particular tone of voice that people use when they have decided they are in charge. It does not care about pushback schedules or passenger compliance assessments, or the 11 years of professional experience that Courtney Briggs carried like a credential. It simply does what it does quietly, insistently, with the blunt democracy of biology. Walter Graves had lived inside his body for 72 years. He knew its language. The first sign was the cold sweat. Not the warm, exertional sweat of movement or anxiety, but this particular cold dampness that gathered at his temples and the back of his neck, without warning, the kind that Dr. Foster had described during their first appointment after his diagnosis as your body's way of filing a complaint. He felt it now, faint but unmistakable, like a thin film of ice forming just beneath his skin. The second sign was at the edges, the way the overhead lights seemed to soften slightly at their borders, the way the sounds of the cabin, the bin closures, the low conversation. The baby 2 rows back began to reach him, as if through a layer of gauze. Not dramatic, not cinematic, just slightly wrongly muted. He pressed his feet flat against the floor. An old trick. Dr. Foster had taught him that when it starts, give yourself an anchor, something physical and real. The floor, the pressure of his good shoes against the carpet, the solidity of the seat beneath him. He was managing. For now. But managing was not the same as fine. Dr. Amara Obi could see it from row 11. She had spent a decade in emergency rooms reading bodies the way other people read text, fast, involuntary, comprehensive. She saw the sweat at Walter's temple. She saw the slight forward lean. His shoulders had dropped by exactly 1 degree. The barely perceptible change in his breathing rhythm that most people would have registered as nothing, and she registered as a flag. She stepped into the aisle again. "This man's blood glucose is dropping," she said, directing her words at Glenn Tate with the flat urgency of someone delivering a clinical finding. "I need someone to bring him orange juice or any sugar source right now. This is not a request. This is a medical instruction." Glenn looked at Courtney. Courtney's expression didn't change. "Beverage service hasn't started," she said. 4 words. Said with perfect professionalism. Said with the calm of someone who has reframed cruelty as policy so many times that they can no longer tell the difference. Dr. Obi stared at her for 1 full second, the kind of second that contains an entire argument, and then turned to the passengers around her. "Does anyone have orange juice, a glucose tablet, candy, anything with sugar?" A woman in row 13 immediately reached into her bag and produced a small carton of apple juice, the kind packed for children with a foil straw attached to the side. She held it out across the aisle toward Walter's row. Courtney stepped forward and intercepted it. "No outside food or beverages during boarding," she said, holding the small carton with 2 fingers. "It's a safety regulation." The woman in row 13 looked at Courtney with an expression that moved through disbelief and arrived somewhere beyond it, in the territory where people go when they have witnessed something so precisely, deliberately wrong that their mind briefly refuses to process it as real. "It's apple juice," the woman said, "for a sick old man." "I understand your concern," Courtney said, and set the carton on the galley counter out of reach. Deshaun Porter's jaw was tight. He had been live streaming for 11 minutes. The viewer count had passed 40,000. The comments were no longer just outrage, they were coordination. People tagging journalists, tagging American Airlines corporate accounts, tagging the FAA. Someone had already clipped the first 3 minutes and posted it separately on 3 platforms. Walter Graves had appeared in the trending column on 2 of them. Deshawn lowered the camera for 4 seconds, just 4, and said directly to Courtney, his voice controlled but stripped of any pretense of deference. You just took juice away from a diabetic man who is going into a medical episode, on camera, with 40,000 people watching. I need you to understand what you are doing right now. Sir, Courtney said, turning to him with the same bright immovability, if you continue to interfere with crew operations, I will have you removed from this aircraft. Then remove me, Deshawn said, after you give that man his juice. Glenn Tate put one hand up, the gesture of a man trying to keep a situation from becoming the thing it already was. Everyone needs to lower their voices. No one is raising their voices, Dr. Obi said, which was true and somehow made everything worse. We are speaking at a completely normal volume about a man who is experiencing early-stage hypoglycemia 12 feet away from us while his medication sits in a trash can. The absence of shouting is not the same as the absence of an emergency. Walter had not spoken for several minutes. He was concentrating. Feet on the floor, hands in his lap, the photograph of Imani in his breast pocket. He could feel its edges through the fabric of his shirt, faint and rectangular and real. He thought about Dorothy, about the way she used to sit beside him at his desk on late nights when he was writing difficult letters to difficult parents, not saying anything, just present. Her particular quality of presence, the way it had always been enough. He reached into his pocket, not for his phone. By reflex, the reflex of a man whose hands have learned over 2 years of careful living to check. The pocket was flat, empty. Of course it was. His phone buzzed. He looked down. The same 202 number, same Washington area code. 3rd time now. He squinted at it. His vision was slightly soft at the edges, which made reading the screen an effort. Something about the number was familiar. Not the full sequence, just the first 6 digits. He had seen them somewhere. Recently. In his contacts maybe, or on a piece of paper that Marcus had. Marcus. The thought arrived slowly through the gauze. Marcus had given him a new number last month. Said he'd switched to a work phone. Said to save it under what had he said? Just save it as Marcus work, Dad. I know you won't remember the number. Walter had not saved it. His phone buzzed a 4th time. With fingers that were not quite steady, Walter Graves pressed answer. Hello? Walter's voice came out thinner than he intended. Not weak. Walter Graves did not do weak, but diminished in the way that bodies under strain will sometimes diminish a voice without the person's permission. The response was immediate. Not a greeting. Not a preamble. Just his name spoken with the particular sharpness of someone who has been trying to reach a person for 20 minutes and has spent those 20 minutes constructing increasingly specific worst-case scenarios. Dad, 1 word. But Walter heard everything in it, the relief that he had answered, the fear that had preceded that relief, and underneath both of those things, the focused, rapidly assembling energy of a man shifting from worry into action. It's Marcus. I've been calling. I'm at C9. I just got off 884 from Denver. I'm still in the terminal. Dad, talk to me. Is something wrong? Walter looked out the window for a moment. The tarmac. The pale sky. The ground crew who did not know that anything unusual was happening aboard the aircraft. They were preparing to push back from the gate. They threw away my medicines, son, he said. Silence. Not a long silence. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. but the quality of it was specific. The silence of a person absorbing information that has just rearranged several things simultaneously. Then Marcus Graves said, "Who?" It wasn't a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It was the sound of a man identifying a coordinate. "The flight attendant," Walter said, and the supervisor backed her up. "I showed them the prescription printout. They said anyone can print something." Another beat. Walter could hear faintly the ambient sounds of a terminal, an announcement over a PA system, the distant shuffle of foot traffic, the soft electronic chime of a gate notification. Marcus was walking. He could hear the rhythm of it. "What flight?" "Twin Towers 291, gate C11. I'm 4 minutes away." A pause, and then with the precision of a man who has learned to be precise because imprecision costs people things they cannot recover. "Dad, I need you to do something for me. I need you to put me on speaker and hand the phone to the flight attendant." Walter looked at Courtney Briggs, who was standing 6 feet away at the galley counter, speaking in low tones with Glenn Tate. She had her back half turned toward him, the body language of someone who considers a situation resolved. "She won't take it," Walter said quietly. "She will," Marcus said. "Hand her the phone." Walter lowered the phone from his ear. He held it out toward Courtney, steady hand, direct gaze, the same posture he had used for 38 years when delivering news that someone did not want to receive but needed to hear. "My son would like to speak with you," he said. Courtney turned from her conversation with Glenn. She looked at the phone, then at Walter, then at the phone again, with the expression of someone being offered something they consider beneath them. "Sir, I am not going to take instructions from a passenger's. My name is Marcus Graves." The voice came through the phone speaker clearly enough to reach Courtney. Without her having accepted the call, Walter's thumb had found the speaker button by instinct. The cabin, which had been maintaining a low, ambient murmur of discomfort, went quiet. "I am the Senior Director of Safety and Compliance for American Airlines, employee ID 3847. I am currently in Terminal C of LaGuardia Airport, and I will be at the door of this aircraft in approximately 4 minutes. I would like to speak with the crew member responsible for disposing of my father's prescribed medications. If that is you, I am asking you to take this phone." Courtney did not move. Glenn Tate went very still. He knew that name. In the architecture of American Airlines' operational hierarchy, Marcus Graves was not abstract. He was the person whose signature appeared on the safety compliance reports that determined whether crew members kept their certifications. How was the person who had personally overseen the retraining program after the 2021 incident in Dallas that had cost 3 flight attendants their careers and the airline $4.7 million in settlement costs. He was the person that Glenn Tate's direct supervisor referred to on the 2 occasions his name had come up in departmental meetings as someone you do not want to be on the wrong side of a report with. Glenn looked at Courtney. Courtney looked at the phone. She did not take it. Instead, she said, and Deshawn caught every word on camera, and 47,000 people watched her say it in real time. "I don't take instructions from passengers' family members. If Mr. Whoever this is has a concern, he can call our customer service line." From the phone, unhurried Courtney Briggs, employee ID 47, B2291, 11 years of service, currently assigned to Flight 2291, LaGuardia to Atlanta. "I have your complete personnel file open on my phone right now. I am also looking at the Federal Aviation Regulation, the American Airlines Medical Device Accommodation Policy Section 4.2, and the ADA Title III Transportation Provisions. You have disposed of a passenger's prescribed medications, denied him access to a substitute sugar source during an observed hypoglycemic episode, and used the aircraft PA system to publicly characterize him as a compliance threat without documentation. I have been watching Deshaun Porter's live stream for the past 6 minutes. I have seen everything. The cabin held its breath. Courtney's face did something complicated. The professional composure was still there. She had worn it for 11 years, and it fit well, but something beneath it had shifted, like a wall that has not yet cracked, but has registered the pressure. Glenn Tate took one quiet step backward. Not dramatic, almost imperceptible. But Deshaun's camera caught it. "I will be at the aircraft door in 3 minutes," Marcus said. "Nobody moves. Nobody touches that trash can. And somebody give my father something with sugar in it right now, because if his blood glucose crashes before I get there, we are no longer talking about a compliance issue. A beat. We are talking about a criminal one." The woman in row 13 looked at Courtney. Then she reached across the aisle, picked up the apple juice carton that Courtney had confiscated and set on the galley counter, and walked it directly to Walter Graves herself. Nobody stopped her. Walter took it with both hands, pressed the foil straw through the top, drank. Outside gate C11. In the long corridor of Terminal C, a set of footsteps was moving with the particular purposeful cadence of someone who has a destination and a reason, and absolutely nothing standing between them and both. They were getting closer. The jet bridge has a particular sound. Anyone who has spent time in commercial aviation knows it, that low, resonant, metallic hum that carries footsteps differently than any other surface, amplifying them, giving them a quality of announcement that ordinary floors don't have. On a quiet aircraft with engines idling and a cabin holding its breath, you can hear a person walking down a jet bridge from 40 feet away. Every head in the first-class cabin turned toward the aircraft door. Marcus Graves appeared in the doorway at 7:04 a.m. He was 44 years old, 6 feet even, wearing a charcoal suit that had been on his body for 2.5 hours. He had put it on in Denver before boarding Flight 884 because Marcus Graves did not own casual work clothes, because in his experience the difference between being heard and being dismissed often came down to whether people could see at a glance that you were someone who expected to be taken seriously. I was not wearing a pilot's uniform. He was not wearing 4 gold stripes or a captain's wings or any of the insignia of the flight deck. I was wearing the suit of a man who operated above the flight deck, who determined from a corner office in Dallas whether the flight deck was staffed correctly, trained properly, and operating within the parameters of federal law. Later, people watching Deshaun's stream would argue in the comments about whether he was dressed as a pilot. He was not. But the authority that walked in with him needed no uniform to announce itself. It was in the pace, the stillness of his expression, the way he moved through the doorway without hesitation, without looking around to get his bearings, because he already knew exactly where he was going and exactly what he would find when he got there. He went to his father first. He crossed the first-class cabin in 8 steps and crouched beside seat 2B, not sat, crouched at eye level, and put one hand on Walter's forearm and looked at him with the focused, searching attention of a son who has been afraid for the past 7 minutes. "Dad, look at me." Walter looked at him. His color was slightly better, the apple juice was working, slowly, but his eyes were tired in a way that went beyond blood sugar. "I'm all right," Walter said. "You're not all right," Marcus said quietly. "But you're going to be." He stood. Dr. Amara Obi was already moving from row 11. She reached Walter's row and introduced herself in 4 words, "ER Physician, Bellevue Hospital," and Marcus nodded and stepped aside without ceremony, because Marcus Graves understood at a fundamental level that the most important thing happening right now was a doctor assessing his father, and everything else could wait 45 seconds. Dr. Obi took Walter's wrist, checked his pulse, looked at his eyes. asked him 3 questions. What day was it? Where were they going? How did his chest feel? Walter answered all 3 correctly and without hesitation, which Dr. Obi registered as a meaningful positive sign. He needs his insulin and his nitroglycerin, she said to Marcus. His pulse is slightly elevated but not dangerous. The juice helped. If he gets his medications in the next few minutes, he'll be stable. Marcus turned from his father. He turned toward Courtney Briggs. She was standing at the galley counter, same position she had occupied for most of the past 22 minutes, and for the first time since Walter had boarded, the quality of her stillness had changed. It was no longer the stillness of confidence. It was the stillness of someone who has realized in the past 4 minutes that the ground they were standing on is different than the ground they thought they were standing on. Marcus looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he walked to the galley trash can, reached in without hesitation, and retrieved both items, the insulin pen and the orange nitroglycerin bottle, and carried them to Dr. Obi. "Can you verify and administer?" "Yes," she said. He watched Dr. Obi check both labels, confirm the medications against Walter's medical ID bracelet, and administer them with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this 10,000 times in conditions far more chaotic than a first-class cabin at LaGuardia. Walter's shoulders dropped by a degree as the nitroglycerin dissolved under his tongue, the particular relief of a body receiving what it has been asking for. Marcus turned back to Courtney. "Courtney Briggs," he said. His voice was level, completely precisely level, the voice of a man who has learned that volume is for people who aren't sure they'll be heard. "Do you know what you've done?" Courtney opened her mouth. "That was not an invitation," Marcus said without raising his voice by a single degree. "I watched the live stream. I saw the confiscation, the trash disposal, the PA announcement, the interception of the apple juice. I have the timestamps. I have 47,000 witnesses. I have a licensed physician's real-time medical assessment on camera. I have my father's prescription printout, which you dismissed as forgeable. And I have your 11-year personnel file, which I have been reading since the Bronx." He paused. Deshaun Porter looked up from his phone. "What's your viewer count right now?" Deshaun looked at the screen. 612,000. Marcus nodded once, not with satisfaction, but with the particular gravity of a man cataloging facts. 612,000 people, he said to Courtney, watched you throw a 72-year-old man's heart medication in the trash. Watched you take juice away from him while he was going hypoglycemic. Watched you use the aircraft PA to tell 160 strangers that my father, a retired public school principal, who spent 38 years in the Bronx putting other people's children through college, was a safety threat. He let that sit for exactly 3 seconds. Glenn Tate. Glenn straightened involuntarily. You are the supervising officer on this aircraft. You were present for every one of those decisions. You made the PA announcement possible by not stopping it. That makes you a party to all of it. Glenn's face had gone the color of old chalk. The cabin was absolutely silent. 600,000 people were watching. And Marcus Graves had not yet raised his voice, had not yet made a single threat, had not yet said the word consequences, and somehow that made everything he was saying land with more weight than shouting ever could have. Here is what happens next, he said. Marcus Graves did not pace, did not gesture, did not perform. He stood in the aisle of flight, Toontown 291. The way a man stands when he has spent 20 years building the authority he is about to use, completely still, completely certain, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have never needed theater to make a point. Courtney Briggs, he said, I am going to explain what you have actually done today, not what you intended. Not what you believed you were doing. What you actually did in terms of federal regulation, corporate policy, and civil law. And then I am going to give you two choices. You will have 60 seconds to decide between them. Courtney said nothing. Her professional composure was still assembled, still visible, but it was the composure of a structure that has lost its foundation. Present on the surface. Hollow underneath. Marcus held up one finger. Federal Aviation Regulation 121.5574 requires crew members to make reasonable accommodations for passengers with documented medical conditions. You were presented with a pharmacy printout bearing a physician's name, direct phone number, and prescription verification code. You dismissed it without attempting to verify a single element of it. That is not protocol. That is a violation of federal aviation law. Second finger. American Airlines Medical Device Accommodation Policy Section 4.2 explicitly states, and I am quoting from memory because I helped write this section, no crew member shall confiscate, relocate, or dispose of a passenger's prescribed medical device or medication without the direct authorization of a licensed medical professional or a designated medical officer. You disposed of 2 prescribed medications. You did not consult a medical professional. Dr. Obi identified herself and offered her assessment, and you directed her to sit down. Third finger. ADA Title III Transportation Provisions. A passenger with documented diabetes and a cardiac condition constitutes a protected class under federal disability law. Creating a hostile environment for that passenger, publicly characterizing him as a compliance threat over the aircraft PA system, and denying him access to a medical substitute when his blood glucose was visibly dropping. Those are not policy discretions. Those are civil rights violations. Personal ones, not the airlines. Yours. He lowered his hand. In addition, he said, there is the matter of the PA announcement. You used official aircraft communications to tell 160 passengers that my father was a safety problem, without documentation, without grounds. That announcement created a hostile and potentially dangerous environment for a vulnerable passenger, and it was captured in full on a live stream that has now been viewed by over 600,000 people and is currently being picked up by CNN, NBC, and the Associated Press. He paused to let that number settle. My father's name is Walter Graves. He is 72 years old. He taught in the South Bronx for 38 years. He is traveling to Atlanta today because his granddaughter is graduating tomorrow morning, and her grandmother, his wife of 41 years, is not alive to see it. That is the man you decided before he spoke a single word to you did not belong in seat 2B. The cabin was so quiet that the sound of Walter's slow, steadying breath was audible to the passengers in the surrounding rows. Courtney's jaw was tight. Her eyes were bright, not with tears, not yet, but with the particular brightness of someone fighting very hard to maintain an expression. You have 2 choices, Marcus said. 60 seconds beginning now. He did not look at his watch. I didn't need to. Choice 1. Voluntary resignation, effective immediately. You surrender your badge and wing to me personally. You leave this aircraft and this terminal. American Airlines issues a neutral employment verification dates of service, no characterization. You will never work for this airline again, but the door to other employment remains technically open. Though I will note that Deshawn's video will be the first result when anyone searches your name, and that will not change. He let her hear that. Choice 2. Termination for cause. I filed the federal civil rights complaint myself today from this aircraft before Wheels Up. American Airlines legal team pursues personal liability for medical harm, which, given that my father's blood glucose dropped to a dangerous level During the period his medications were withheld, they will have substantial grounds for. The FAA violation goes on your permanent record, which means no commercial aviation certificate anywhere in the United States. And I refer the matter of passenger endangerment to the Port Authority, who will determine whether criminal charges are appropriate. 40 seconds had passed. Courtney looked at Glenn. Glenn was looking at the floor with the focused intensity of a man trying to become two-dimensional. She looked at the passengers. Deshawn's camera was steady. The woman in row 13 held her gaze for exactly 1 second and then looked away, not from discomfort, but from the particular discretion of someone who understands that this moment does not belong to them. She looked at Walter Graves. He was looking out the window. His hand rested on his breast pocket over the photograph of Imani. He did not look back at her. 20 seconds, Marcus said. Courtney Briggs closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them, something in her face had changed. The composure was still there, it would probably always be there. Worn so long it had become structural, but underneath it something had given way. Not dramatically, not with the visible collapse of a person who has accepted defeat. Just quietly. The way a door closes. "I resign," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Clearly," Marcus said. "For the record." She straightened, looked at the cabin, the camera, the 160 people who had watched 11 years of her professional life arrive at this moment. "I resign from American Airlines effective immediately." Marcus held out his hand. Courtney unpinned her wings with fingers that were not quite steady. She removed her employee badge. She placed both items in Marcus Graves's open palm, with the careful movements of someone performing an action they cannot undo and know it. Marcus pocketed them without looking at them. "Security will escort you off this aircraft," he said. "You are no longer authorized to be aboard any American Airlines property." 2 gate agents appeared at the aircraft door. They had been waiting in the jet bridge since Glenn had quietly radioed for them 4 minutes ago. In the particular way of people who can see which way a situation is moving and want to be positioned correctly when it arrives. They flanked Courtney. She walked toward the door. At the threshold, Marcus spoke one final time. "Before you leave this aircraft, you will apologize to my father. Not to save your career. That's already gone. Because a 72-year-old man sat in that seat for 22 minutes and never once raised his voice at you, and he deserves to hear the words." Courtney stopped, turned back, looked at Walter, who had turned from the window and was watching her now with those steady, patient eyes, the eyes of a man who had spent 38 years seeing people clearly. "Mr. Graves," she said, "I was wrong. About everything. I'm sorry." Walter looked at her for a long moment. "I know you are," he said. "I hope you learned something from it." Courtney nodded once and walked off the aircraft. Her 11-year career ended in 22 minutes of prejudice, and the door swung shut behind her with the small, ordinary sound of something that cannot be reopened. For a moment after Courtney left, nobody moved. The cabin held the particular stillness of people who have witnessed something real, entertainment, not spectacle, but an actual human reckoning, and are still in the process of deciding what it means to have been present for it. The overhead lights hummed. The engines idled. Somewhere in coach, a child asked a question in a small voice and was answered in a whisper. Then the woman in row 13 began to clap. It was not a performance. It was not the coordinated applause of a crowd that has been cued. It was the sound of one person deciding privately and without calculation that something deserved to be acknowledged. A few passengers in the surrounding rows joined. then more. Within 10 seconds, the entire first-class cabin was applauding, and the sound carried back through the curtain into coach, where passengers who had heard fragments and seen nothing began to clap for reasons they couldn't fully articulate, because sometimes the body registers justice before the mind has finished processing it. Marcus stood in the aisle and absorbed it without expression. This was not a moment for him. It had never been a moment for him. He turned back to his father. Walter Graves was sitting in seat 2B with his hands folded in his lap and his medications back in his breast pocket, and his color returned to something close to normal. And he was looking at his son with an expression that Marcus had seen only a handful of times in his life, the last time being at Dorothy's funeral in the front pew of Greater Mount Zion Baptist Church in the Bronx, when Walter had reached over and taken Marcus's hand without a word. "You didn't have to come, son," Walter said. "Yes, I did, Dad," Marcus said. "I absolutely did." He sat down in the empty seat beside his father, the aisle seat 2A, which had been unoccupied for the entire boarding process, and for a moment, in the middle of everything, they were just two people, father and son. The complicated, irreducible fact of that relationship, which no job title or corporate hierarchy or viral live stream could touch. Marcus's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen. Robert Isom, CEO, American Airlines. He answered it openly without stepping away, because there was nothing about this conversation that needed to happen in private. "Robert." The CEO's voice carried the measured urgency of a man who has been watching a situation develop for 20 minutes and is now calling to get ahead of it. "Marcus, I've seen the stream. I want you to know you have the full backing of this organization. Whatever you need." "I need 3 things," Marcus said in the same level tone he had used for the past 30 minutes. "First, a formal corporate apology issued to my father and to every passenger on this flight from your office today. Second flight, as soon as the crew is settled and the passengers are ready. My father has a graduation to get to tomorrow morning. Third, I want to talk about Med Verify when I'm back in Dallas." A brief pause. Med Verify, a boarding protocol, cross-referencing passenger medical device registrations with crew briefings at the gate. "We've talked about it for 2 years. After today, I think we stop talking." "Set the meeting," Isom said. "You have my full support." Marcus ended the call. He stood and addressed the cabin not with a prepared speech, but with the direct, unadorned language of a man who means what he says and says only what he means. "Ladies and gentlemen, American Airlines formally apologizes for what you witnessed and experienced on this aircraft today. What happened to my father represents a failure of our training, our culture, and our basic obligation to the people we serve. It will not happen again, and I mean that in the specific structural sense, not the aspirational one. This airline is going to change how it handles passenger medical accommodations, beginning with this conversation. I am sorry you were here for what happened. I am glad you were here for what came after." Glenn Tate appeared at the edge of the galley. He had been standing slightly apart from everything for the past several minutes, occupying the uncomfortable space of a man who made the wrong call and knows it and is waiting to find out what it costs him. He stepped forward now, not summoned, but moving of his own volition, which Marcus registered as a meaningful distinction. "Mr. Graves," Glenn said to Walter. Not to Marcus, to Walter. "I owe you an apology. I had enough information to stop this 20 minutes before I did. I chose hierarchy over judgment. That was wrong. I'm sorry." Walter looked at him with the same steady eyes he had turned on Courtney. "I accept that," Walter said. "Use it." Glenn nodded. He would be placed on administrative review within 48 hours, reassigned to ground operations, required to complete 80 hours of bias and medical accommodation training. He accepted all of it without protest, which was, Marcus would note in his report, the first correct decision Glenn had made all morning. Dr. Obi stopped by seat 2B on her way back to row 11. She checked Walter's pulse one final time, a quick professional assessment, and pronounced him stable, improving, fit to fly. "You should eat something substantial when they start service," she told him. "Real food, not just juice." "Yes, doctor," Walter said with the faint, dry humor of a man who has been told what to eat by younger people for most of his adult life. Dr. Obi smiled. Then she looked at Marcus. "Your father handled himself with more grace today than most people manage in an entire lifetime." "I know," Marcus said. "I learned it from watching him." Deshaun Porter leaned across the aisle from row 14. His stream was still live, 1.4 million viewers now, a number that was climbing so fast the display could barely keep pace. He looked at Walter with the expression of a young man who came onto this flight with a client meeting on his mind and is leaving it with something considerably larger. "Mr. Graves," he said, "I just want you to know I wasn't going to stop recording. Not for anything." Walter looked at him. "I know, son. Thank you." 1.4 million people, Deshaun said quietly. "They all know your name now." Walter reached into his breast pocket. Not for his medications this time, those were secure. He took out the photograph of Imani worn at the edges, the girl with the acceptance letter and the vanishing eyes and the whole future unspooling in front of her. He looked at it for a moment. "Good," he said. "Then maybe tomorrow when she walks across that stage, they'll know hers too." Outside gate C11 flight 2291 began its pushback from the terminal 1 hour and 7 minutes late, carrying 162 passengers and the weight of everything that had happened since 6:43 in the morning. The LaGuardia tarmac slid past the windows. The pale sky opened up ahead, and Walter Graves in seat 2B window side pressed his hand gently against his breast pocket. Medications photograph, 38 years of quiet dignity, all held together in the same small space, and watched the ground fall away. 5 months after flight, Walter Graves sat in a hearing room in the Dirksen Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C., and told his story to 11 members of the Senate Subcommittee on Aviation Safety and Civil Rights. I wore his charcoal suit, the same one that had been folded in his carry-on the morning Courtney Briggs decided before he spoke a word what kind of man he was. He had pressed it carefully the night before in his hotel room 2 blocks from the Capitol, the same way he had pressed the Navy button-down for Imani's graduation, because Walter Graves had always understood that how you presented yourself to the world was a form of statement, and he intended to make his clearly. He spoke for 22 minutes without notes. He described the insulin pen and the nitroglycerin bottle. He described the pharmacy printout that anyone could apparently print. He described the PA announcement 160 strangers told, without evidence that he was a problem. He described the apple juice. He described the cold sweat at his temples and the softening edges of the overhead lights and the photograph of Imani in his breast pocket, which he took out now and held up briefly for the committee, a small worn rectangle of paper that had traveled from the Bronx to LaGuardia to Atlanta and back to Washington, and still showed a girl with vanishing eyes and a whole future ahead of her. "I am not here," Walter said, "because I want Courtney Briggs to suffer any more than she already has. I am here because what happened to me happens to other people, on other flights, in other terminals, on other mornings, to people who don't have a son with an employee ID and the authority to walk down a jet bridge. I am here for those people." Senator Patricia Holloway of Georgia, who had been listening with the focused stillness of someone taking careful internal notes, leaned forward. "Mr. Graves," she said, "what would have happened if your son hadn't been in that terminal?" Walter looked at her. "I would have deplaned," he said simply, "without my medications, and you would not have heard my name." The room was quiet for a moment. "That," Walter said, "is the whole problem." The Med-Verify protocol was announced by American Airlines 14 days after Flight 2291, developed by Marcus Graves and a team of medical and legal specialists over 6 weeks of accelerated work. It required all passengers with registered medical conditions to be flagged in the crew briefing system at boarding, not as risks, but as accommodations. Crew members were required to cross-reference any medical device question against the passenger's boarding profile before taking any action. A licensed medical professional hotline was made available to all flights in real time. Within 4 months, 7 additional airlines had adopted versions of the protocol. The FAA issued a guidance document citing Flight 2291 as the precipitating case. Delta United and Southwest each announced independent implementation timelines. The American Medical Association, which Dr. Amara Obi had contacted within 48 hours of landing in Atlanta, published a formal position paper on medical accommodation in commercial aviation, the first of its kind that referenced Walter's case in its opening paragraph. Dr. Obi herself was appointed to the FAA's newly formed Passenger Medical Rights Advisory Board. She accepted the position while maintaining her ER rotation at Bellevue because she told the reporter from the Times who called to ask about it. Emergency medicine teaches you that systems either protect people or they fail people. There is no neutral position. Deshaun Porter's video reached 70 million views across all platforms. It was included in the curriculum of 4 law schools, 2 business schools, and the FAA's own crew training program for bias recognition and medical accommodation response. Deshaun, who had gone to Atlanta for a client meeting and come back with something he hadn't anticipated, donated the monetization from the video to a scholarship fund at Roosevelt High School in the Bronx Walters School. The one he had run for 38 years, the one that had shaped hundreds of lives in the particular quiet way that good institutions shape lives without announcing it. He named the scholarship the Dorothy Graves Memorial Award after Walter's wife. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl from the South Bronx who wanted to study medicine. Courtney Briggs did not work for another commercial airline. Her name returned as the first search result on every background check attached to a video that 70 million people had watched and that law schools used as a case study in discrimination and institutional failure. She moved back to her hometown in Ohio. What she did there, and whether she found the thing that Walter Graves had said he hoped she would find something to learn from it, was not recorded. Glenn Tate completed his 80 hours of mandatory retraining and returned to ground operations at LaGuardia. He sent Walter a letter handwritten 4 pages, which Walter read once and kept in the same drawer as Dorothy's photograph from Imani's 8th birthday party. He did not show it to anyone, but he kept it. Marcus Graves was promoted to Vice President of Inclusive Operations in January, overseeing safety compliance and the industry-wide rollout of Med-Verify. He took the job on one condition: that his office remain in Dallas, not the corporate headquarters in Fort Worth, because Dallas was where his father's cardiologist was, and Marcus Graves had learned on a Tuesday morning in May at LaGuardia some things about proximity and presence that he did not intend to unlearn. And Walter Graves sat in the front row at Spelman College's commencement ceremony on a warm Saturday morning in Atlanta, in his charcoal suit, with his insulin pen and his nitroglycerin in his breast pocket, beside the photograph of a girl who was now walking across a stage in a black cap and gown. Imani first, in her class full scholarship, whole future unspooling, And when she found his face in the crowd and smiled, Walter Graves pressed one hand against his chest over everything he carried there and smiled back. Dorothy would have loved this, he thought. And then Imani's name was called, and she crossed the stage, and the world kept moving, as it does, as it must, a little more accountable than it was the morning before. Some people carry their dignity so quietly that the world mistakes it for weakness. Walter Graves never raised his voice, never made a scene, never asked for anything except what was already his. And in the end, his silence said more than any argument could, because dignity, true dignity, does not need to announce itself. It simply endures until the world catches up. If this story stayed with you, if you've ever been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like you didn't belong in the room, you had every right to be in. Tell us where you're watching from and what it meant to you. Your story matters here. And if you believe that accountability is not optional, that one person's quiet courage can move entire systems, you already know this channel is worth staying for.